The dust kicked up by Jake Morrison's horse settled slowly in the desert heat as he approached the small frontier town of Copper Ridge. His weathered face showed the signs of countless days under the burning sun, and his clothes bore the dust of 1,000 miles of wandering. Jake had been drifting from town to town for 3 years now, ever since the war ended and he found himself with nowhere to go home to. As he rode down the main street, something felt wrong about this place. The usual bustle of a frontier town was absent. People hurried along the wooden sidewalks with their heads down, avoiding eye contact. Store owners quickly pulled their curtains shut when they saw strangers passing by. Even the saloon, which should have been alive with music and laughter, stood eerily quiet. Jake tied his horse to the hitching post outside the general store and stepped inside. The elderly shopkeeper, a thin man with nervous eyes, looked up from his ledger with obvious fear. "We're closed," the man said quickly, though the store was clearly open and stocked. "Just need some supplies," Jake said calmly, his deep voice carrying the authority of a man who had seen his share of trouble. "Coffee, beans, maybe some information about what's got everyone in this town acting like they've seen ghosts." The shopkeeper's hands shook as he gathered the requested items. "Mister, if you're smart, you'll take these supplies and ride out of town before sunset. This ain't a place for decent folks anymore." Before Jake could ask what he meant, the sound of horses thundering down the street made both men freeze. Through the window, Jake saw a group of armed men in dusty clothes riding hard toward the center of town. Their leader, a massive man with a black beard and cold eyes, wore a deputy's badge that gleamed in the afternoon sun. "That's Deputy Marshal Crenshaw," the shopkeeper whispered. "Him and his boys run this town now. Sheriff died of a mysterious illness 2 months ago, and ever since then, things have gone from bad to worse." Jake watched as the riders stopped in front of the courthouse. Crenshaw dismounted and began shouting orders to his men. "String up those ropes. I want everyone in town to see what happens to thieves and troublemakers." The shopkeeper grabbed Jake's arm. "They're about to hang 2 Apache girls. Say they stole horses, but everyone knows that's a lie. Those girls never hurt nobody. Their father was a peaceful chief who signed treaties with the government. But Crenshaw's been looking for an excuse to stir up trouble with the Apache." Jake's jaw tightened. He had fought alongside Apache scouts during the war and knew them to be honorable people when treated fairly. The idea of hanging innocent girls made his blood boil. But he also knew that one man against Crenshaw's gang would be suicide. "How many men does Crenshaw have?" Jake asked. "Maybe 15 or 20. They call themselves deputies, but they're really just hired guns. Word is that someone's paying them to cause trouble between the whites and the Apache. If those girls hang, it'll mean war for sure." Jake paid for his supplies and walked back outside. A crowd was gathering in the town square, though nobody looked happy about what they were being forced to witness. Jake could see the fear in their faces. These were decent people who had been terrorized into silence by Crenshaw and his gang. Near the courthouse, 2 young Apache women stood with their hands bound, nooses already around their necks. They couldn't have been more than 18 or 19 years old. Despite their terror, they held themselves with dignity, refusing to give their captors the satisfaction of seeing them break down. Crenshaw climbed onto a wooden crate to address the crowd. "People of Copper Ridge," these savage thieves thought they could steal from honest white folks and get away with it. "Today they learned the price of crime in our town." An old woman in the crowd called out. "Those girls never stole nothing, Crenshaw. Everyone knows you planted that evidence." Crenshaw's cold eyes found the woman in the crowd. "Careful, Mrs. Henderson. Wouldn't want folks to think you're sympathizing with horse thieves. Might make people wonder if you're hiding something yourself." The woman shrank back into the crowd, silenced by the threat. Jake realized that Crenshaw had the entire town living in fear. Anyone who spoke out against him would likely find themselves facing trumped-up charges. As Crenshaw continued his speech, Jake noticed something that made him suspicious. Several well-dressed men stood apart from the crowd, watching the proceedings with satisfaction rather than horror. They wore expensive clothes that seemed out of place in a frontier town, and one of them kept checking a gold pocket watch as if he was on some kind of schedule. Jake's military training kicked in as he studied the situation. The positioning of Crenshaw's men, the timing of this public execution, the presence of the well-dressed strangers, it all suggested something bigger than simple frontier justice. Someone was orchestrating this event for reasons that went beyond punishing supposed horse thieves. The sun was getting lower in the sky, and Jake knew he had to act soon, but rushing in without a plan would only get him and the girls killed. He needed to be smart about this. Find a way to save the Apache Maidens while exposing whatever conspiracy was really behind their persecution. As Crenshaw prepared to give the signal for the execution, Jake Morrison melted back into the shadows between buildings, his mind already working on a plan that would require all of his skill, courage, and luck to pull off successfully. Jake moved silently through the alley behind the courthouse, his boots making no sound on the packed earth. Years of scouting during the war had taught him how to move like a ghost when necessary. He needed to get closer to understand what was really happening here. From his hiding spot behind a water barrel, he could see the well-dressed strangers more clearly. One man in particular caught his attention, a portly figure in an expensive suit who seemed to be giving subtle signals to Crenshaw. Every time this man nodded, Crenshaw would make another threatening gesture toward the crowd or adjust the nooses around the girls. Next, Jake's suspicions were confirmed when he overheard a conversation between two of Crenshaw's men standing guard near the back of the courthouse. "Boss says after we string up these Apache girls, the whole tribe will come looking for revenge," one of them whispered. "Yeah, and then Mr. Davidson's mining company can move in and take over all that Apache land once the army drives them off," the other replied. "Smart plan if you ask me." So that was it. Jake now understood the conspiracy. Someone named Davidson wanted Apache tribal lands, probably for mining rights. By framing innocent Apache girls and executing them publicly, they would provoke the tribe into attacking the town. This would give the army an excuse to drive the Apache off their ancestral lands, leaving Davidson free to claim the territory for his mining operations. Jake had seen similar schemes during the war, where unscrupulous businessmen would manipulate conflicts to grab valuable land. The thought of innocent people dying for corporate greed made his blood boil. As he pondered his next move, Jake heard footsteps approaching his hiding spot. One of Crenshaw's guards was making rounds, checking the alleys for any potential troublemakers. Jake pressed himself against the wooden wall of the building and held his breath as the guard passed within 3 feet of his position. When the guard moved on, Jake crept toward the side of the courthouse where the Apache girls were being held. He could see them clearly now, 2 young women who showed remarkable courage in the face of certain death. The older girl, probably the leader, was whispering something to her younger companion, offering comfort even in their darkest hour. Jake knew he needed a distraction to save them, something that would draw Crenshaw's men away from their prisoners long enough for him to cut their bonds and help them escape. But he also needed evidence of the conspiracy to prevent this kind of injustice from happening again. His opportunity came when he spotted a stack of oil-soaked torches near the courthouse entrance. If he could create a fire somewhere else in town, it would force Crenshaw to send some of his men to deal with the emergency. During the confusion, Jake might have a chance to rescue the girls. He circled around to the other side of town, moving carefully to avoid being seen. Near the edge of Copper Ridge stood an old abandoned barn that would burn quickly but wasn't close enough to threaten any occupied buildings. Jake struck a match and touched it to a pile of dry hay in the corner of the barn. Within minutes, flames were leaping toward the roof, and thick black smoke was billowing into the evening sky. Someone in town shouted, "Fire!" and Jake heard the sound of running feet and confused voices. Just as he had hoped, Crenshaw was forced to send half his men to form a bucket brigade and prevent the fire from spreading to other buildings. The deputy marshal himself stayed with the prisoners, but now he had only 7 or 8 men instead of 15. Jake made his way back toward the courthouse, moving from shadow to shadow. The crowd had thinned out as people ran to help fight the fire or fled to protect their own property. The well-dressed strangers had also disappeared, probably not wanting to be associated with the chaos. As Jake got closer to the gallows, he could see that the 2 Apache girls were still standing strong despite their terror. The older girl caught sight of him in the shadows and her eyes widened slightly, but she was smart enough not to give away his position. Crenshaw was growing impatient with the delay caused by the fire. "We're not waiting any longer," he shouted to his remaining men. "These savage thieves hang now, fire or no fire." Jake knew his time was running out. He had managed to reduce the odds, but taking on 8 armed men in an open gunfight would still be nearly impossible. He needed another advantage, something that would level the playing field. Then he remembered the dynamite he had seen in the general store. Many frontier towns kept explosives for mining or clearing stumps, and the shopkeeper had mentioned that Copper Ridge was built near several mining claims. If Jake could get his hands on some dynamite, he could create enough chaos to rescue the girls and expose the conspiracy. But first he needed to prevent the hanging from proceeding while he put his plan into motion. From his hiding spot, he could see that Crenshaw was about to give the final order. Jake made a quick decision that would either save the day or get them all killed. He stepped out of the shadows with his hands raised, calling out in a clear voice, "Hold on there, Deputy Marshal. I've got information about a bigger conspiracy that you need to hear." Crenshaw spun around, his hand moving immediately to his gun. "Who the hell are you, stranger? And why should I listen to anything you have to say?" "Name's Jake Morrison," he replied calmly. "And if you hang those girls before hearing what I know about Mr. Davidson's mining operation, you're going to miss out on the biggest payday of your life." The mention of Davidson's name made Crenshaw's eyes narrow with interest and suspicion. Jake had gambled that greed would make the corrupt deputy marshal curious enough to delay the execution, at least temporarily. "You've got 1 minute to convince me not to put a bullet in you right here and now," Crenshaw growled. Jake kept his hands visible as he stepped closer to Crenshaw, knowing that one wrong move would end his life and doom the Apache girls. His mind raced as he tried to buy more time while working out the details of his plan. "Davidson's been paying you to cause trouble with the Apache, right?" Jake said loud enough for the remaining crowd to hear. "But what he hasn't told you is that there's already gold on Apache land, lots of it. I've seen the geological reports myself." Crenshaw's eyes flickered with greed, but he kept his gun trained on Jake. "You're talking nonsense, stranger. Even if there was gold, what's that got to do with these horse thieves?" "These girls aren't thieves," Jake continued, gesturing toward the 2 Apache women. "They're the daughters of Chief Running Bear. Their father discovered the gold deposit 3 weeks ago and was planning to negotiate mining rights with the territorial government. Davidson found out and decided it would be easier to steal the land than pay for it." The crowd began murmuring among themselves. Several people knew Chief Running Bear as an honest man who had always kept his word in dealings with white settlers. The idea that his daughters were thieves had never sat well with many of the townspeople. Crenshaw shifted uncomfortably. "Even if what you're saying is true, it don't change nothing. These girls were caught with stolen horses. Horses that Davidson's men planted in their camp," Jake said firmly. "I can prove it. Those horses have Davidson Mining Company brands on them, burned over with fake Apache markings. Any blacksmith in town could tell you that those brands were altered recently." One of Crenshaw's men whispered urgently in the deputy marshal's ear. Jake caught enough of the conversation to understand that they were growing worried about his claims. If the townspeople started examining the evidence too closely, the whole conspiracy might unravel. "Enough talk," Crenshaw suddenly shouted. "I don't care what this drifter thinks he knows. These Apache girls hang now." He turned toward his men to give the order, and Jake knew his time was up. He had failed to talk his way out of the situation, and now he would have to fight his way through. His hand moved toward his gun, but he knew he couldn't outdraw 8 armed men. At that moment, salvation came from an unexpected source. The old shopkeeper emerged from the crowd carrying a rifle, followed by several other townspeople who had apparently found their courage. "Hold it right there, Crenshaw," the shopkeeper called out. "This man's right about those horses. My boy Jimmy saw your men driving them toward the Apache camp 2 days ago. We've all been too scared to speak up, but we're not going to stand by and watch innocent girls hang for crimes they didn't commit." More people stepped forward, some carrying weapons, others just standing in solidarity. The blacksmith pushed through the crowd, holding up a horseshoe. "I examined those horses myself when you brought them in as evidence," he announced. "The brands were definitely changed recently. You can still see the original Davidson mining marks underneath the fake Apache symbols." Crenshaw's face twisted with rage and desperation. He realized that his carefully planned scheme was falling apart before his eyes. "All of you stay back," he screamed, swinging his gun wildly between Jake and the approaching townspeople. "I'm still the law in this town, and these prisoners are going to hang." Jake saw his chance as Crenshaw became distracted by the crowd. He dove to his right, rolling behind a wooden crate as bullets began flying. The 2 Apache girls, showing remarkable presence of mind, threw themselves flat on the gallows platform to avoid the crossfire. The battle was brief, but intense. The townspeople, finally fed up with months of intimidation and corruption, fought with the fury of people reclaiming their freedom. Several of Crenshaw's men, realizing they were outnumbered and that their cause was lost, threw down their weapons and surrendered. Crenshaw himself tried to make a run for his horse, but Jake intercepted him with a flying tackle that sent both men crashing into the dirt. They wrestled for control of Crenshaw's gun, rolling back and forth in the dust as the crowd watched anxiously. Jake's war experience gave him the edge he needed. He managed to pin Crenshaw's gun arm and deliver a powerful right cross that left the corrupt deputy marshal unconscious in the street. As Jake stood up, brushing dust from his clothes, the crowd erupted in cheers. The shopkeeper and several other men quickly freed the two Apache girls, cutting their bonds and removing the nooses from around their necks. The older girl, whose name was Morningstar, approached Jake with tears of gratitude in her eyes. "You saved our lives," she said in perfect English. "We will never forget this kindness." "Your father's an honorable man," Jake replied. "No child of his deserved to die for another man's greed." As the immediate crisis passed, Jake realized that their work was far from over. Crenshaw and his gang were just the hired muscle in this conspiracy. The real villain, Davidson, was still free and probably making plans to try again with a different approach. "We need to find Davidson," Jake told the gathered townspeople. "As long as he's free, he'll keep trying to steal Apache land. Next time he might be smarter about it." Morningstar stepped forward again. "My father and our warriors are already tracking Davidson's men. When we heard about the false charges against my sister and me, Chief Running Bear sent scouts to watch all the routes out of town. Davidson is trapped here, whether he knows it or not." Jake smiled grimly. "Then let's go pay Mr. Davidson a visit. It's time for him to answer for his crimes." The crowd began organizing itself into search parties, determined to find Davidson before he could escape or cause more trouble. The corrupt deputies who had surrendered were locked up in the town jail, and plans were made to send for a real territorial marshal to sort out the legal mess. As they prepared to hunt down the mining company owner, Jake couldn't help but feel proud of how the townspeople had found their courage when it mattered most. Sometimes all it took was one person willing to stand up to a bully, to inspire others to do the same. The search for Davidson began immediately as the sun started to set over Copper Ridge. Jake organized the townspeople into groups, making sure each team had at least one person familiar with the local terrain. Morningstar insisted on joining the hunt, despite Jake's concerns for her safety after the ordeal she had just survived. "Davidson tried to murder my sister and me," she said firmly. "I have the right to see him brought to justice." Her younger sister, Gentle Rain, chose to remain in town to help care for the wounded and to send word to their father about what had happened. The two sisters embraced before Morningstar mounted one of the recovered horses and joined Jake's search party. The blacksmith, whose name was Tom Bradley, provided valuable information about Davidson's recent activities. "He's been renting a room above Murphy's saloon for the past month," Bradley explained. "Claimed he was here to survey potential mining sites, but now we know he was really planning this whole scheme." They made their way to Murphy's saloon, which stood at the far end of the main street. The building was dark and appeared empty, but Jake approached cautiously anyway. His military instincts told him that cornered men were often the most dangerous. The saloon owner, Murphy himself, emerged from the shadows with his hands raised. "Don't shoot," he called out nervously. "I'm not part of whatever Davidson was planning. I just rented him a room. Where is he now?" Jake asked. "Gone," Murphy replied. "He came running in here about 20 minutes ago, packed his things in a hurry and rode out the back way. Said something about meeting his partners at the old silver mine up in the hills." Morningstar's eyes lit up with understanding. "I know that mine. It was abandoned 10 years ago when the silver played out. It's about 5 miles north of here, hidden in a canyon. Perfect place for a man to hide while he plans his next move." Jake gathered his search party and explained the situation. The abandoned mine would be an ideal hideout, but it would also be easy to defend if Davidson had more men with him. They would need to approach carefully and be prepared for a fight. As they rode toward the hills, Morningstar told Jake more about the conspiracy that had nearly cost her and her sister their lives. "Davidson's been trying to buy Apache land for months, but our tribal council always refused his offers. The prices he suggested were insulting, barely enough to feed our people for a few weeks. So he decided to take it by force," Jake observed. "Worse than that," Morningstar continued. "He's been spreading lies about our people to other mining companies, telling them that we're violent savages who can't be trusted. If his plan had worked and we had gone to war over the hanging, It would have given all the mining companies an excuse to demand that the army remove us from our ancestral lands. The more Jake learned about Davidson's scheme, the more disgusted he became. This wasn't just about one mining claim. Davidson was trying to destroy an entire way of life for the sake of corporate profits. They reached the entrance to the canyon just as the last light was fading from the sky. Jake called a halt and studied the terrain ahead. The narrow passage between the rock walls would funnel them into a perfect ambush position if Davidson's men were waiting. "There's another way in," Morningstar whispered. "An old Apache trail that goes around the back of the canyon. It's steep and dangerous in the dark, but it would let us approach the mine from behind." Jake considered the options. The frontal approach was obvious but dangerous. The back trail was safer from ambush but risked injury from the treacherous terrain. Finally, he decided to split their forces. "Tom, you take half the men and circle around to the back trail with Morningstar," he instructed. "Give us 30 minutes to get into position at the front entrance, then move in. If Davidson's men are watching the main approach, we'll keep them busy while you come up behind them." The plan was risky, but it was better than walking blind into an ambush. Jake's group dismounted and approached the canyon entrance on foot, moving as quietly as possible over the rocky ground. As they got closer to the abandoned mine, they could see flickering light from inside the main shaft. Voices carried on the night air, though the words were too distant to make out clearly. Davidson was definitely here, and he wasn't alone. Jake positioned his men behind rocks and fallen timber near the mine entrance. From their hiding spots, they could see 2 guards posted outside, both carrying rifles and looking nervous. These men clearly weren't professional gunfighters like Crenshaw's gang had been. They were probably just miners or hired workers who had been dragged into Davidson's scheme. One of the guards was smoking a cigarette, the glowing tip marking his position in the darkness. The other was pacing back and forth, obviously worried about something. Jake could hear him muttering under his breath about wanting to get out of this mess. Inside the mine, Davidson's voice suddenly rose in anger. "I don't care what went wrong in town," he shouted. "We stick to the plan. Those Apache lands are worth millions, and I'm not giving up just because some drifter caused trouble." Another voice, calmer but equally determined, responded. "The territorial authorities will be here soon, Mr. Davidson. If we're caught here, we'll all hang for conspiracy and attempted murder." "Nobody's hanging anybody." Davidson snapped. "We've got enough men and guns to fight our way out of this territory. Once we're across the border into Mexico, we can start over with a new plan." Jake realized that Davidson was planning to flee the country rather than face justice for his crimes. If the mining company owner escaped to Mexico, he might never be brought to trial for what he had done to the Apache girls and the people of Copper Ridge. The sound of a horse whinnying in the distance told Jake that Tom's group was getting into position. It was almost time to spring their trap on Davidson and his remaining conspirators. Jake watched the guards carefully, waiting for the right moment to strike. The nervous guard had stopped pacing and was now leaning against a wooden post, his rifle held loosely in his hands. The smoker had finished his cigarette and was reaching for another one, distracted by the simple task of lighting it. From somewhere behind the mine, Jake heard the soft hoot of an owl, the signal from Tom's group that they were in position. It was time to move. Jake signaled to his men, and they began creeping forward through the shadows. The plan was to capture the guards silently if possible, avoiding a gunfight that might give Davidson and his men inside the mine time to escape through some other exit. Just as Jake was within striking distance of the nervous guard, disaster struck. One of the townspeople stepped on a loose rock that clattered down the slope, echoing loudly in the canyon. Both guards spun around, raising their rifles and peering into the darkness. "Who's there?" the smoker called out, his voice tight with fear. "Show yourselves or we'll start shooting." Jake had no choice but to abandon stealth. He launched himself at the nearest guard, tackling the man before he could fire his rifle. They hit the ground hard, wrestling for control of the weapon as shouts erupted from inside the mine. The other guard started shooting wildly into the darkness, his muzzle flashes lighting up the canyon like lightning. Jake's men returned fire, and within seconds the night was filled with the crack of rifles and the whine of bullets ricocheting off rock walls. Inside the mine, Davidson's voice roared over the gunfire. "It's a trap. Get to the horses! We're getting out of here." Jake finally wrestled the rifle away from his opponent and knocked the man unconscious with the butt of the weapon. Around him, the battle was intensifying as more of Davidson's men emerged from the mine shaft, firing as they ran toward a corral where their horses were kept. Tom's group appeared from behind the mine right on schedule, cutting off Davidson's escape route and trapping the conspirators in a deadly crossfire. The mining company owner himself appeared in the mine entrance, a portly figure in an expensive suit that was now torn and dirty from hiding in the underground tunnels. "Davidson," Jake called out. "It's over. Surrender now and nobody else has to die." Davidson's response was to pull out a pistol and fire wildly in Jake's direction. The bullet went wide, striking sparks from a metal ore cart near the mine entrance. "I'd rather die than spend my life in prison," Davidson screamed. "You've ruined everything." The gun battle raged for several more minutes, with Davidson's men gradually being overwhelmed by the superior numbers and positions of their attackers. One by one, the mining company employees threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender, realizing that their cause was hopeless. Davidson himself proved to be the most stubborn fighter. Even when all his men had given up, he continued firing from behind an overturned wagon near the mine entrance. His expensive clothes were now shredded and covered with dust, and his face was twisted with rage and desperation. "You don't understand what you're destroying," Davidson yelled during a brief lull in the fighting. "That Apache land contains enough gold to build a railroad across the entire territory. The progress and prosperity it could bring. Built on murder and lies," Jake responded grimly. "No amount of gold is worth innocent lives." Morning Star suddenly appeared beside Jake, moving with the silent grace that had made her ancestors such effective warriors. She had somehow circled around during the fight and was now in position to end the standoff. "Mr. Davidson," she called out in her clear, strong voice, "I am Morning Star, daughter of Chief Running Bear. You tried to murder my sister and me to steal our people's land. Now you will face justice for your crimes." Davidson spun around to face this new threat, his pistol wavering between Jake and Morning Star. In that moment of distraction, Tom Bradley appeared from the other side and knocked the weapon from Davidson's hand with the barrel of his rifle. The mining company owner collapsed to his knees, finally defeated. "It's not fair," he whined, all his bluster suddenly gone. "I had it all planned perfectly. Those Apache savages don't even know what to do with all that gold." Morning Star stepped closer to Davidson, her dark eyes blazing with controlled anger.
"My people have lived on that land for hundreds of years without needing your gold."
"We know its true value, not as something to be dug up and sold, but as the foundation of our way of life." Jake and the other men quickly secured Davidson and his surviving conspirators. As they were tying up their prisoners, Tom Bradley made a disturbing discovery in the mine shaft. "Jake," he called from inside the tunnel. "You need to see this." Jake followed Tom into the mine, carrying a torch to light their way. Deep inside the shaft, they found a cache of weapons and supplies that suggested Davidson's plans were even more extensive than they had imagined. "Look at this," Tom said, pointing to a stack of army uniforms and ammunition. He was planning to dress his men as soldiers and attack Apache villages, making it look like the army was starting a war. Jake examined the evidence with growing horror. The fake uniforms were good enough to fool most people at a distance. If Davidson's plan had succeeded, it would have triggered a massive conflict between the Apache and the territorial government, giving mining companies an excuse to seize vast amounts of Native American land. This conspiracy goes deeper than we thought, Jake realized. Davidson wasn't working alone. Someone with connections to army suppliers helped him get these uniforms. Morning Star joined them in the mine, her face grim as she saw the evidence of Davidson's true intentions. "My father must be warned immediately. If there are other mining companies involved in this conspiracy, our people could still be in danger." As they prepared to return to Copper Ridge with their prisoners and evidence, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they had only uncovered part of a much larger scheme. The journey back to Copper Ridge took most of the night, with Davidson and his men bound and riding under heavy guard. The mining company owner had fallen into a sullen silence, apparently realizing that his schemes had finally caught up with him. As dawn broke over the desert, Jake could see smoke rising from the town's chimneys, a welcome sight after the long night of violence and revelation. When they reached the main street, they found that word of their success had already spread throughout the community. People emerged from their homes and businesses to watch as the conspirators were led to the jail. The Apache girl Gentle Rain ran to embrace her sister Morning Star. tears of relief streaming down her face. The real territorial marshal arrived later that morning, summoned by telegraph messages that the townspeople had sent during the night. Marshal Williams was a stern, weathered man who listened carefully as Jake, Morningstar, and the others explained the full scope of Davidson's conspiracy. "This is bigger than just one mining company," Marshal Williams confirmed after examining the evidence from the mine. "We've been investigating reports of similar schemes in other territories. It appears that several Eastern investors have been working together to manipulate conflicts with Native American tribes for financial gain." Davidson, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison, finally began to cooperate with the authorities. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he provided names and details about his partners in the conspiracy. "There's a whole network of them," he admitted bitterly. "Businessmen in Chicago, New York, even some government officials in Washington. They've been planning this for years, waiting for the right moment to grab Apache and Navajo lands throughout the Southwest." The information Davidson provided would lead to investigations and arrests across multiple territories, ultimately exposing one of the largest land fraud conspiracies in American history. But for the people of Copper Ridge, the most important result was the restoration of peace and justice to their community. Chief Running Bear arrived in town 3 days later with a delegation of Apache warriors and tribal elders. The chief was a dignified man in his 50s, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that showed both wisdom and strength. His reunion with his daughters was a moment of pure joy that brought tears to the eyes of many townspeople who witnessed it. "Jake Morrison," the chief said when Morningstar introduced them, "my daughter tells me that you risked your life to save her and Gentle Rain from a death they did not deserve. Our people will not forget this kindness." Jake felt somewhat embarrassed by the attention and praise. "I just did what any decent person would do, Chief. Your daughters are brave women who deserved better than what Davidson had planned for them." The chief smiled at Jake's modesty. "Perhaps, but not every person would have had the courage to stand against 15 armed men. You have proven yourself to be a warrior and a friend to the Apache people." Over the following weeks, the full truth about Davidson's conspiracy continued to emerge. The fake army uniforms led authorities to uncover a corrupt quartermaster who had been selling military equipment to civilians for years. Several mining companies were found to have invested in Davidson's scheme, and their executives faced federal charges for conspiracy and fraud. The people of Copper Ridge worked together to rebuild their community's sense of safety and trust. Crenshaw's corrupt deputies were replaced by honest lawmen, and the town began to prosper as word spread that it was once again a safe place for travelers and settlers. Morningstar and Gentle Rain became regular visitors to the town, helping to build bridges between the Apache tribe and the white settlers. Their father, Chief Running Bear, negotiated fair and honest mining agreements that brought prosperity to both communities while protecting Apache traditional lands. Jake found himself torn between his old habit of drifting from place to place and the growing sense of belonging he felt in Copper Ridge. The townspeople had made it clear that he would always be welcome among them, and several local businesses had offered him permanent employment. "You don't have to keep running from place to place," Tom Bradley told him one evening as they shared a drink at Murphy's newly reopened saloon. "You've got friends here, Jake. Real friends who appreciate what you've done for this community." Jake considered the blacksmith's words carefully. For 3 years he had wandered the frontier with no real purpose beyond survival and the occasional odd job. But his experience in Copper Ridge had reminded him of something important, that sometimes a man could make a real difference in the world by standing up for what was right. "I appreciate the offer, Tom," Jake replied thoughtfully, "but I think there are other towns out there that might need help dealing with men like Davidson and Crenshaw. Maybe it's time I stopped running away from trouble and started looking for places where I can do some good." Morningstar, who had been listening to their conversation, nodded with understanding. The path of a warrior is not always about staying in one place. Sometimes we must travel where we are most needed. Before leaving Copper Ridge, Jake attended the trial of Davidson and his conspirators. The mining company owner received a 20-year prison sentence, while his hired guns got shorter terms in exchange for their cooperation with federal investigators. The corrupt quartermaster was court-martialed and dismissed from the army in disgrace. As Jake prepared to ride out of town on a bright autumn morning, nearly the entire population of Copper Ridge gathered to see him off. Chief Running Bear presented him with a beautifully crafted Apache knife as a token of friendship and respect. "This blade has been blessed by our medicine man," the chief explained. "It will bring you protection on your journey and remind you that you will always have a home among the Apache people." Jake mounted his horse and looked back at the faces of the people he had come to care about. Tom Bradley raised his hand in farewell, while Morningstar and Gentle Rain smiled at him with gratitude that needed no words. Even Murphy, the saloon owner, had come out to wish him well. "Take care of yourselves," Jake called out to the crowd. "And remember, decent folks need to stand together when trouble comes calling. That's the only way to keep men like Davidson from destroying what you've built here." As he rode away from Copper Ridge, Jake Morrison felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't experienced since the end of the war. There were other towns, other innocent people who might need someone willing to stand up against corruption and greed. The frontier was still a dangerous place, but it was also a land where one person's courage could make all the difference between justice and tyranny. Behind him, the smoke from Copper Ridge's chimneys rose straight up into the clear desert sky, a sign of a community at peace with itself and its neighbors. Jake touched the Apache knife at his side and smiled as he rode toward whatever adventures and challenges awaited him down the trail.